All right, the brief history of typography. How does it go? So like I said, I don't say that I know everything about typography or the history of typography. I'm just really interested about it. So this is my view of it. There's the presentation. And at the end of these slides, there are a couple of basic things about typography, like the theoretical basics. So in the very beginning, there was, of course, the image. So you have to start from somewhere. And I thought I've always liked these Lascaux paintings because they are everything else but primitive. But yes, people were making images right from the start when we started being people. But what we also did in the beginning was symbols. I mean, see these marks here, they are not, these little marks, they are not depicting anything. They're probably a symbol. And all around these caves with cave paintings, there are also symbolic scratchings and markings. And of course, we have no idea what they mean. We also don't have much idea if these are supposed to depict real animals or if they are gods or something else, or maybe tribal symbols. Which brings us to the next thing. There were also tribal markings right from the start, and images were made everywhere. This is from the Siberian so-called princess, a mummy that has been found from Siberia. You might have seen these. I think she's about 5 to 7,000 years old. So tattoos were one of the oldest art form that there is. I think this is also from the same mummy, but also the ancient Egyptians did a lot of tattoos, and they were usually abstract signs for, well, usually luck. For instance, if you were a woman and you became pregnant, then a tattoo priestess would make you these lucky tattoos in certain places of your body, so that the some demons would not well, that there would be like some god protecting your child from demons through those markings. So the markings and symbols and pictures were used in many different ways, just as they are today. So when we think of hieroglyphs, we think of this kind of stuff that is set on stone and looks like something that depicts something or almost depicts something. But actually, most of the ways people used hieroglyphs was more casual. Like if you were a scribe and you wanted to write a letter to somebody or on somebody's behalf, usually, then you didn't use these kinds of symbols. Well, yes, they were based on these symbols, yeah, but much more quicker to make and much more abstract. So they became pictograms. And by the way, the technology or the medium where the writing was done has always been one important factor. For instance, here the cuneiform script was made on a wet clay tablets, so you can only do a certain kind of markings on wet clay, that is that will hold when you actually burn the clay tablet. And the word pictures or pictograms quickly became also signs for syllables and for phonemes. And much of ancient Egyptian writing is like, well, puns, actually. But here you can see nicely how the signs looked like when people wrote them down on papyrus. So they became more abstract. They have some resemblance to Chinese writing, I think. So here's well, example of how the letter A evolved from the head of an ox in Egyptian to the Western, to the Phoenician script, and to Greek script, and then to Western or Roman letters. And then there's also how it became the Arab sign Aleph and the Hebrew sign Aleph. So I think in the Roman letter A, it's the depiction of the ox is more striking as in the Arabic or Hebrew signs. Like you can, if you turn this letter around, then you can actually see the horns of the ox and the head. Okay, I mentioned the that it's important where the writing appears. So when there was paper and later parchment, which is basically the hide of an animal, then first people made scrolls out of that. And that was the basic format for reading. And reading was not happening silently. It was always read aloud, and read aloud for several people usually, or maybe only one family, or maybe a class. But usually also when and if people read on their own, they read aloud. There is even one Greek philosopher who has been credited to the invention of reading on your own, not aloud, but silently. So that was a big invention in its time. Then there was not only paper and parchment, but there was also this thing called a wax tablet. And we in modern days have almost totally forgotten this, although now we are using tablets of different sorts. But it's I find it funny how long this sort of tablet was actually used, like, I don't know, at least 4,000 years. So basically you put some wax over a tablet, like, and then make it smooth. And then you can write on it. And because it has this lid, you can close it, and then you can take it to the like 500 kilometers to somebody else, and it's like a letter. Or you can use it at school, and you can quickly erase it, what's there. So that's why it was still used in Finnish schools in the early 20th century. And yeah, the tablet came always together with a stylus. This one seems to be quite a new model. There's one example of Roman times, I think, where we can see how the tablet was used. So this had several so-called pages or spreads, so you could put a lot of information there. Or you could also draw on the tablet and then erase what you had drawn, or you could use it as a counting device. So this is from a Greek, some Greek pottery. I like this image because it really looks like he was using a laptop, but it's a writing tablet, a wax tablet. But yeah, be it on papyrus or a cave wall or parchment, as soon as there was images and symbols and writing, then the people doing those had to think about how to put them together. Like they had to do these layout decisions. And what about empty taking space? Should one leave empty space or not? Should it be used smartly? Yeah, by the way, there's a very nice use of empty space or negative space between the figure and the crocodile, and also the ends of the picture. I don't know what he's actually doing, why he has the crocodile on a leash. Maybe it's a pet crocodile.
The knife kind of indicates it might not be a pet.
Could be. I don't know if you can make a pet out of a crocodile. Probably not.
No, but he was holding a giant knife, so I'm thinking it may have been something else than a pet.
Could be. But I'm trying to be nice and think that's not a knife, but something else. Could be just, well, anyway. So people had to make decisions such as how would one read, like in Asian script, the reading order was from the right to the left and from up to down often. And in Western writing, it very much differed until the Middle Ages, at least. Like many Greek scripts can be read from first from left to right, and then when you get to the end of the line, then it goes from right to the left, which has a logic of sorts, of course. If you think that it's not for reading silently on your own, but for reading aloud. And then we get slowly to the Middle Ages, and there were quite a few new inventions in typography then, not just in Europe, but well, in Europe there were a lot of monks and nuns who were basically writing things down and also making a lot of great art. But what they did invent was something called a folio, or a bound book, that was also invented elsewhere in the world. So the Europeans were not so specific. But word spaces were nice, especially if you want to read silently. And then as you have a bound book, then you also have a spread, or 2 pages at once. Then you have footnotes, and as you can see in this example, there's one big wide column and then a smaller column. And they invented margins, also not a small thing. By the way, here in this example, I love the color of the text, like the ink has been not so well. As you can see, the color of the text changes from each word, and also inside each word, depending on how thick the ink is. You can see where the ink is flowing less. And like I said, elsewhere in the world, books were written. In Middle America and South America, there was a lot of literature. This is not one of the original ones, but it's been made by somebody who knew the old traditions. The reason why almost nothing of the original literature has been spared from South America, from the Incas or so on, was that the Europeans who came there, they systematically burned all the literature in big fires or pyres. And they were bold enough to wonder why the native people were weeping so much when they watched their books burn. And it took like years to burn all of the books. They have written about it in their chronicles. But, oh, it was so hard to find all the books. Oh, it was such a terrible work. Oh, but they did it. They burnt all the culture, one continent or two. Okay, going to Southeast Asia, this is a Burmese palm leaf book, also from the Middle Ages. This was a very popular format for Buddhist texts and other kinds of texts, and it was also very handy. You could well carry these books much more easily than you could like this European sort of folio book that still weighed like 10, 20 kilograms or something. So this you could just put in your bag and take anywhere. And when it was new, the images were probably much better looking. Now it's worn. You put the binding here in the middle where you can see the holes. So palm leaves. Okay, so other inventions were, of course, made in the Middle Ages, like punctuation, which is also handy to have, and where we still have these rules of punctuation are changing all the time. Like you probably notice in social media that people have in the last 10 or 20 years have started to use punctuation in very different ways than what they have learned in schools. So things are in change all the time. Oh, and the @ sign, yes, this is, I think, the first time it was used. This is from a medieval Greek manuscript. But there's a long history of the @ sign, and you can read it on your own if you want more precise information on it. And yes, it's good also to remember that the European capital letters and lowercase letters, or the majuscules and the minuscules, were invented in the Middle Ages. They say there's a theory that it was originally some sort of a misunderstanding, or maybe a mix-up, that two different kinds of scripts were being like mixed up. But then there's another competing theory that says that already the Romans, when they wrote their Roman capital letters on paper or papyrus, maybe, then they used a sort of system that was a little bit like the minuscules. So anyway, that leaves us with capital letters and lowercase letters. Then things went on, and also printing technology with movable type was invented in the Middle Ages, around the year 1000 in China. Now I don't remember. It was, I think the guy was called Bi Sheng. But these were first made of wood, and the metal movable type came later in the 14th and 15th century, and that was invented also all around the world. Of course, in Europe, most of you probably have heard of Gutenberg. So it was not a new thing when Gutenberg built his press. And one reason that coincided with the movable type and the printing technology was playing cards. They also started to be popular in China first. Well, it was also that China introduced paper money, and then people started to use the paper money for playing cards, and then from there they started to make specific playing cards, and that rage in playing card games went through the Silk Road to the Arabs, and then the Arab world, which was as large as it is now. It was as large then, or even bigger. So the Arabs started also playing card games, and then the Europeans got on the rage, and suddenly printing presses were needed in a bigger capacity than before. And of course that was, the movable type was not good news to monks and nuns who had been making these very elaborate, very beautiful, also very expensive books in their monasteries. So many of them became jobless, basically. And of course, there was the first mass media became a thing. So at first, still the printed books, for instance, the Gutenberg Bible, it mimicked the handwritten ones. But then when people used it for mass media, then they needed to print something fast and on cheap paper. So the way the letters looked like changed because of their new functions. Like this is from the Gutenberg Bible. Just look at these special effects, like this gold leaf here. That's beautiful, and all of these have been hand painted. And I think the red here has also been put with by hand. But if you try to read this, it's like it's not very easy to read. Like the letters look very much similar to each other. So maybe yes, if you use this for reading to a congregation as a priest, then you don't need to read it very fast. But it's not a fun thing to read this kind of text. So if you compare it with this, for instance, which is one of the first used papers, well, the letters still look a little bit similar to these, but there has been a lot of changes made already here. That you can actually read it. So if paper was quite expensive until the 19th century or so. So when you used paper for printing mass media or big editions of books, then the paper needed to be thin and maybe also small. So it was often very absorbent. And the words and letters had to be readable also in very small sizes, not just in these big folios. And when you have absorbent and thin paper, the ink will be absorbed, and the letter shapes will become a bit fuzzy. So the basic shapes have to be such that even if the ink goes a little bit into the paper, then it has to be readable. So here's one example. This is already from the 15th century by Jensson. So very much more readable than the Gutenberg Bible. What do you say? So what was important was that the letter should not be the same width at all the places. So for instance, here with the Q, you can see that these parts are thicker than the upper parts. And then there are these things called serifs, which also clarify the letter. Also, they are a reminder of antiquity and when people used to write all of the text by hand. Okay, here's Garamond from the 16th century. And I chose an example where the ink has, has been absorbed into the paper, but you can still see the letter shapes and you can read it. And you have to remember that also lighting conditions in the before the 20th century were usually pretty poor. So if you wanted to read something by candlelight, then the letter shapes had to be really clear. So now we go on to Caslon. If I remember correctly, Caslon was not a person, but more like a company. So they wanted to make this typeface available for all the languages there were, or they could think about. Here we go to English Baskerville. So you notice that these, ornamental scripts did prevail, as they still prevail, but you don't use this as text that you have to read for a long time, but for specific occasions. Then we go further in time to Bodoni. And you can note that now the contrast between the thick lines and the thin lines is very extreme. And the letter is also becoming more geometric in shape. Like the serifs now are, well, basically lines only. And here's the door. All of these scripts, all of these typefaces are still around, by the way. That's the thing with typefaces and with typography. It does change, but the older stuff doesn't go away. Like we start talking about modern scripts from the 18th century upwards. So this is called Clarendon from the 19th century, and now I might want to explain what this slab serif style means. There are other names for it too, but I like the slab serif because now the serifs and also the everything that is horizontal lines look like these slabs of metal, maybe, especially in the capital letters, but also here, for instance. So this was the century of like mass media advertisements and big paper was becoming more less expensive, and you could have big advertisements all over streets. And then in the 20th century, people were very, well, tired of the well, colorfulness of the 19th century, well, where there were like hundreds of very different kinds of typefaces. So people wanted to have clarity. Also, technology had gone a little bit further again. So this kind of typeface is called the sans serif, which was, by the way, well, the first sans serif was in the early 19th century, I think, but the 20th century really took off with it. And now if you look with the Futura, if you look at the contrast between the, or inside the letters, it looks like the lines are of even thickness. Well, that's an optical thing. They are not even, but they are made to look even. And yes, no serifs. Look, Mom, no serifs. So sans serif means no serifs. Then there's Universe. I think that was by Adrian Frutiger. Universe tried to be a universal typeface with a lot of different fonts, as you can see. And also this one is still used. And then we go to Helvetica, which has been said is one of the most popular typefaces of the world. This was well made in Switzerland, and I think in the last few years there was a new version of Helvetica. They had prepared it for like 20 years. So I think I should mention the Bauhaus school at this point. Bauhaus was not the only one. There was also a similar one in Russia, but the Bauhaus one was more, well, better known in Western Europe and in America. So the Bauhaus school was not, it was about new architecture. It was about mass-produced, good-looking furniture, mass-produced, good-looking, well, everything, actually. And it was also about new ways of making art and new ways of making typography and layouts. And the tradition that art students have weird customs and weird parties, and that they dress in black, comes from the Bauhaus school. And it was it had to move a couple of times in Germany until it was well, forbidden. And the people from the Bauhaus school went to other places than Germany. Some of them went to Switzerland. Well, typographers in specifically went to Switzerland, and they started a typographic revolution. Well, as revolutions go, it was quite tame, but it did have a big influence. So you can go and see the links later on. So here's another name of a typographer that you might want to remember, Jan Tschichold. And no, I didn't sneeze, that was his name. Tschichold. Even if you can't pronounce his name, it's good to remember him. And well, I read that he originally wrote his name even with even more consonants, but he cleaned up a couple of consonants away from it. Anyway, you can see some of his style. Like they started to think about typography and also about type in new ways. They didn't abandon the old rules. This is, for instance, the old rule for how to make a medieval manuscript spread. But they started to play with the old traditions, and while they did it, they invented new rules. So here are some examples of Tschichold's work. So he broke the rule that everything should be either horizontal or vertical. Of course, the Chinese had done this like millennia ago, but Europeans are sometimes slow. And note also how he uses abstract elements as well, active parts of the composition. And also the empty space becomes even more important. Later on, when you go into layouts, you will learn about learn more about these things. So I'm not going to talk that much more, but here's about that. But here's the the Gutenberg Bible and a film poster made by Tschichold. So you can compare that. So the new typographic revolution didn't mean that there were no rules. It was just that the old rules were expanded and used in new ways. And of course, time went on, and these were some of the, well, what followed the Swiss Revolution in the 1950s. So please note that writing by hand didn't go anywhere, didn't go away in the 20th century. It was still used. It was used for commercial purposes. So here are some more advertisements, which all have some something to do with the typographic revolution that Tschichold and his colleagues started. So the actual secret is that you use a sort of grid to put your the text and the images in place, and you learn more about grids later on. Okay, and I mentioned the writing by hand. Here you can see how the film posters use calligraphy in in a striking way. And also people were starting to push letters harder and harder into new directions. Like these are basically drawn letters, not written letters, or at least these ones. Or maybe they are even cut out letters. And the images and the text all form one whole thing, a unified thing. So the images and text are not separated from each other. And that's how it should be. So these are then from the late 60s, early 70s. And note the letter shapes again and how the letters and the image form one unified whole in both of these. So letters were really being pushed to interesting new places. But at the same time as this was happening too. So things were becoming increasingly electronic and digital. So first of all, these kinds of letters and numbers could be seen on, well, clock radios, for instance, or text TV, things like that. And nobody in their right mind was thinking in the 1970s that everything would be digital. Well, maybe some people did, and they were right. But of course, this was not very good looking yet, but that would change. And all through the 20th century, there were some big revolutions in printing technology and the technology, how type was shown, how text was shown, and that had consequences, like the monks and nuns that became jobless in the at the end of the Middle Ages. Then also many old professions just didn't exist anymore. Like overnight, it seemed that something that you and maybe your father and grandfather and grandmother had done for a couple of centuries, that profession didn't exist anymore. And if you were lucky, then you could maybe get a job as a professor somewhere, but you had no idea about the new technology. But of course, there were gains and new rules and conventions. But one unintended consequence was also that really bad typography became really, you could see bad typography even more than before, like everywhere. Okay, so here's here at the end of the slide set, I put some of these basic things that you might want to know. So, for instance, here, if you thought this image was a good example where you can really compare these different kinds of scripts. Like you can see how a slab serif differs from a sans serif, and how the modern style differs from the old style or from the transitional. And here are some of the words that we use. So for instance, baseline, that's something that is good to remember. You will also be using these when using the Glypher software. So baseline is where the letters start, but sometimes also they go over the baselines. For instance, the O's and S's, everything where it goes, where there are round shapes, they usually go a little bit over or actually under the baseline. Then here you can see the X height, or the lowercase letter height, but the lowercase ascenders go all the way up here to the ascender height, which is a little bit higher than the height of the capitals usually, which is the cap height. And then you have the descender height, which is where the lowest point of your descender goes. And yeah, this was only the start. There are other things to remember. Here are a couple more of them. There's also the letter spacing. That should be proportionally the same between each letter. And proportionally the same means optically the same. So you can't really calculate it. You have to do it by eye. But I guess with AI, you can nowadays make it by machine. Okay, so you know already what a serif is. Also, you know what a descender or an ascender is. Then there's the stroke. And this is called the aperture, but yeah, you don't need to remember all of these, but yeah, leading is good to remember. And no, you don't say leading, you say leading, because it comes from lead. Because in the old days, the letters were cast in lead, which is the metal. So this is the leading, like the distance between the baselines is the leading. And here's one more, which also there are a bit more terms. Sorry about the resolution, but yeah, there's still the neck and the loop and the ear. I don't remember all of these, but if I need them, then I go Google them. But if you really want to make a whole typeface, not just one font, then you might like to know these terms. Every once in a while, there is somebody who wants to make a typeface, or at least a good font for their thesis work, for instance. Okay, and here's the last slide. Hmm.